Hello, ECE 256. This is a short screencast on family value systems. We've been talking a lot about recognizing where all families in your program or that you're working with are coming from. And this is just the next step to consider the value systems of the family that you come from and the families that you're working with. So the first thing we want to talk about is cultural pluralism as a value. What's cultural pluralism? It is a family value, and there's different ways to consider how you value cultures in your family. Many cultures can exist together, and as they exist together, enhance each other, right? So the idea of cultural pluralism is often represented as a salad, a tossed salad, right? All the different pieces could represent different cultures that remain individual, they remain their own piece of the salad, and when mixed together with other cultures, tomatoes with lettuce, with cucumbers, right? When they're all mixed together, they make deliciousness. Cucumbers aren't turning into tomatoes or lettuce in order to make that salad successful. When a family values cultural pluralism, the idea of everyone remaining who they are, these values preserve diversity because each unique culture can remain as they are. All of their unique identities are allowed and accepted. The idea of adding cultures together creates bicultural people, right? And this is something that we should value, we should see as very important to our society, to have many cultures represented. Cultural pluralism is sort of the response to the historical belief labeled as the melting pot, right? This is a very old-fashioned way of people describing the United States, in that everyone came together, blended and melted into one culture. Everyone was expected to drop their unique identities and move around our societies looking the same as everyone else. That was the acceptable way to be, right? What this does is ends up having one culture replace others. Instead of being a tossed salad, we're now a blended soup where everybody's been boiled down, all the different cultures, been boiled down, chopped up, and blended together to make one consistent soup. You can't tell the difference from one person to the next, right? And so the uniqueness has been lost in this model. So these are two different ways to value culture in a family, right? Going back to the melting pot, on our instinct, that's a good value, that we're all coming together, right? But now we know, after years and years and years of studying human psychology, the human experience, human development, we now understand the importance of remaining unique. We understand the gaps that come with that system of expecting everybody to be the same. Okay, so when there are cultural differences, what does that really mean? If two cultures have very different values, what does that look like? They might value, like I mentioned before, literally how we move around the world. Some people might expect you to be much more quiet, much more smooth. Others might think being loud and obnoxious is a strong characteristic, right? Cultural rules. We all grew up with cultural rules. Generally, these are learned by simply being a part of a culture. There's not really official lessons. And most of these rules are invisible to those of us who grew up in that culture. We can't really name them. Other people who aren't part of our culture will notice them more than we will, right? And another difference between cultures might be if they value independence versus interdependence, or where on the spectrum these two are valued. Some things in life might be considered very important to be independent about. Other things it might be really important to work together on. And so different families are going to follow different values on each of these realms, right? You'll need to be responsive to different families that might come into your program or that you might serve. At the same time, is you'll need to be able to recognize where your values stand. So let's take a look at the independence versus interdependence. What does valuing independence look like? Families who focus on independence will encourage early self-help skills with their children. They'll encourage independence on the playground, at the library. As the children grow up, they'll offer more and more chances to practice this. And what we see come out of these values are what we call pattern 1 individuals. And I'll get into more details about what that means later in this presentation. The interdependence view, families who focus on interdependence often will prolong babyhood, or they wouldn't label it that way, but they would, help children for longer periods of time in the ways that we support babies than others might think is considered culturally appropriate or socially appropriate, right? They maintain relationships, and relationships often remain the highest priority. There's often very strong connections when interdependence is valued, because interdependence requires people to remain connected in order for the culture to operate and for all of the little systems to work, right? And these values often lead to individuals we label as pattern 2, okay? And of course, between independence and interdependence, there's, like I mentioned before, a spectrum, and different parts of a family's life might represent each of these views a little bit to varying degrees. So when we think about conflicting goals and values between programs and families, children who participate in childcare programs or other programs where we serve that family might have conflicting goals and values. So in pattern 1, if the program is expecting children at nap time to sleep completely alone, that maybe in a family childcare home, children are expected to sleep in their own rooms, and that being an individual is really valued. But then when they go home and the family has pattern 2 expectations where baby sleeps with parents or mom or caregivers, they may not have their own room. They may be expected to sleeping with siblings, and being an individual is not very highly valued in this family. What kind of conflict could arise if the program and the family are expecting 2 different things? Okay, something to consider and be aware of so that you can ensure children and families feel successful in your program. How might these differences show up? And how children respond to different activities in the classroom, how families or children's attitudes toward activities show up. They didn't like that art project because it represented something that went against their family values. How the adults model different expectations within the classroom or at home for how children should behave, right? Views on how children learn, views on how clean we keep our space, views on many different things. All of these can show up, and children will let you know if the values of the classroom look really different than the values from home. Okay, and all of these things can be considered if conflict arises, if you can consider where that family or that child is coming from. That's the best way to figure out what to do about the situation. We're not really going to talk about solutions today. We're just sort of opening up this sort of can of worms for discussion in our face-to-face class. Contrasting cultural patterns. This is where we talk more a little bit about the pattern 1 values versus the pattern 2 values. Pattern 1 values, expression of feelings is really important. Personal power and assertiveness. So pattern 1 values want to emphasize autonomy, teaching children how to stand up for themselves, how to take care of themselves, okay? Where pattern 2 sees the group as a basic unit, not the individual. There's a mutual sense of dependence upon each other. Children are taught to blend in, okay? And again, just be aware not to put your values on a child who might have different values being impressed upon them at home, but to be able to see what values they're bringing from home and acknowledge those values are legitimate. You don't have to agree with them. You don't even have to support them. In our classroom, here's how we operate things, but I see you and I see the values that you're bringing here. Now let's work together to make this work. How do we help children understand and value cultural pluralism? We try to teach them to work on their own ethnocentrism. This is a big word. We want to celebrate who they are. We don't have to give anything up about who they are when they're in our classroom, right? We celebrate each child's family and where they come from and what they bring to our group, which makes our group better. We communicate with each other, over-communicate, right? We want to accept other realities as valid. We want to not only, as the adults in the room, accept all the children's, but help the children learn to accept other children's realities as value. Just as much as they want to be seen and valued, we need to help them understand that taking the perspective of other people is really important. Perspective taking is kind of what we call this, being able to accept other people's realities as valid. Again, we don't have to agree with those other realities, but everyone has a right to their own reality, and they should be able to bring that reality into our group space and be acknowledged and valued. And simply the fact that having many, many realities in our group makes our group wonderful. There's so many values to that idea. We also just want to model the children's and the adults' own bicultural experiences. We celebrate when people in the room have more than one culture that they can teach us about, right? Honor those differences. Lastly, we really want to make sure we're supporting home languages. This is so, so important. Advocating for supporting a child's home language if it's different than the language used in the classroom. And you may have to, talk to your directors to get more support. Having two languages is so good for brain development. We know that now. We know that supporting bilingual programs is really important. We know that understanding the advantages of being bilingual helps in advocating for these services. And then using the opportunity to show the relationships between 2 or 3 different languages can be so valuable in another childhood classroom. So I went through this really fast, and I hope that we'll be able to fill this in more in our face-to-face class, but hopefully you'll be able to fill out the online module packet. Thanks.